Have you ever had to face it as a prosecutor or a defense lawyer, something like this?
The defendant has pleaded guilty to all 5 counts charged in the indictment. Under oath before Your Honor, he has admitted that the charges against him are true.
Parts of my job, especially is like after a trial and someone's having to go off to prison, is the family members, the mothers, the fathers, the wives, the children of these people who, through their actions, caused, this devastation within their own family.
I don't know. Somebody reached out to me and they said, this is a copycat. Killer.
5 University of Florida students were murdered. It happened over the course of 3 days. And there are a few similarities between that case and the University of Idaho quadruple murder.
But I also wanted to address with you, do you think that Brian Kohberger, if he had gotten away, would do this again?
Yes, 100%.
All right, we're joined today by my friend Phil Holloway. And if you've been following my different channels, you've seen Phil around on Layback Law. He's also appeared on America's Untold Stories in the past, and he is now going to be part of the Megyn Kelly network with, I think it's MK True Crime. Is that it, Phil?
Yeah, that's right. MK True Crime. It's that's the name of it on all the socials, and also YouTube, Twitter, X, MK True Crime, and it's our effort to kind of break into the true crime genre, right? With in the trial watching, we're going to have lots of good stuff that we're looking forward to. Really digging into some of these high profile trials like Kohberger. There's always one that's up next, it seems like. So there's plenty of content to cover and plenty of new cases in the pipeline.
For sure. And I wanted to bring you on today, literally to talk about Brian Kohberger. I interviewed Howard Bloom about the case already, and you should be able to see that at the link on the top right of your screen. And when I interviewed Howard, Brian Kohberger had just topped the plea or put in the plea, and there was still a gag order, and he hadn't been sentenced. So there's some things kind of hanging out there. And I wanted to see if we could kind of wrap it up and then hopefully send him on his way to rot in prison for the rest of his natural born life. And may it take time. I hope he gets to rot for a long time. He's a very young guy, and he's looking at decades in prison right now.
Well, he's not going to be very well liked, and he's certainly going to go into that prison with something of a bullseye on his back, if you understand what I'm saying. I mean, if he's not held in strict isolation, who knows how long he's going to make it, but time will tell. He may get the Dahmer treatment.
I was going to say Jeffrey Dahmer, but what? I have no sympathy for him or the people he's around. I mean,
Jeffrey Dahmer met his death this morning while working as a janitor, cleaning a prison bathroom. Another inmate is suspected of beating him to death at this prison in Wisconsin.
But I feel like a lot wasn't resolved in his case. And
oh, yeah.
Dare I say, I feel cheated. And I know that may not be fair, but I think the families also feel cheated that this guy could just go in and flagrantly just not answer any questions. There's no allocution. I think back to the BTK killer, who I know that Brian Kohberger seemed to be very interested in, according to Ramsland and others. He had a full-blown allocution. I mean, he sat there during the sentencing and he talked about, I broke in the house, I did X, Y, Z, literally broke down every single thing.
Somewhere between 7 and 7:30.
This particular location, did you know these people?
No, that's no, that was part of my I guess my what you call fantasy. These people were selected.
Now that was in Kansas. I don't know if the laws are different in Idaho than Kansas, but can you explain why it is he could just go and say, yep, Yeah.
You know, I mean, this is all you're spot on. You've nailed all the issues. The problem is it rests with the district attorney, because let's back up for a second. It's been portrayed by the DA as Kohberger accepted their plea deal. No, it was actually the other way around, because if you remember, the defense wanted to present some other people could have done it kind of defense. And they had 4 specific individuals that I think were college students that they wanted to suggest to the jury could be the real killer. But the problem was they had no evidence, right? And so they had this harebrained idea to just try to come in and smear innocent people. And the judge at a pretrial hearing said, no, I'm not going to allow you to do that. And I think that was obviously the right ruling.
The defendant has also waived appeal on the multitude of rulings from this court and Your Honor's predecessor in Latah County on dozens, literally dozens of motions seeking to dismiss the case, seeking to control or limit evidence, seeking to offer evidence that would not be appropriate. And we appreciate the court's consistent rulings based on the law, based on the facts. As Your Honor will recall, on June 18th, it's just really not that long ago, we appeared before this court for arguments on what became the defendant's final motions to this court. Motion where they wanted to offer evidence suggesting that other people were responsible for the defendant's actions, and the motion seeking essentially an indefinite continuance of the trial. It was readily apparent to all of us in the courtroom from Your Honor's comments that those motions were not going to be granted.
It was a crazy thing to even think of. If you have some legitimate, like, proof or evidence that maybe somebody else did it, that's one thing, but you can't just smear people just to try to divert attention from your client. So the judge shut that defense down. And as soon as that motion hearing was over and the judge said, you can't present that defense, Kohberger's team actually went to the DA and they said, look, we will plead to the sheet. That means the entire indictment if you take the death penalty off the table. And it's actually the prosecutor that agreed to Kohberger's terms. Okay. So that's, I guess that's okay. But what's not okay is the DA didn't ask for any terms of their own. Apparently they could have said, and here's what I would have done, Eric. I would have said, look, all right, if all the families are okay with it, and they have to all be okay with it, and the surviving victims, if every victim is okay with it, and if your client sits down with us and does an exhaustive recorded interview where he shells down the corn and lays it all out and said, this is what I did, this is exactly how I did it, and this is why I did it. If he does that and he is truthful when he does that, then we may consider your proposal to take the death penalty off the table. But they didn't put any kind of conditions like that on it. They let Kohberger set the terms. I'm going to plead guilty if you take the death penalty off the table. So I just can't quite get my head wrapped around why they would agree to Kohberger's terms. I do understand, look, victims, families, surviving victims, look, they are traumatized every time there's an appeal, right? And so, you know, if it's a death penalty case, you're going to have lots of extra appeals and it could go on for a long time. And this is just going to consume their life. They're never going to get over it, but they might be able to start moving forward with their lives. And if it's tied up with an appeal, you know, a lot of times they can't do that. So I do understand why some families might say this is the best outcome, but it wasn't unanimous. A lot of the families didn't want this.
But in fairness, if they did get that, there wouldn't be appeals because he would have already agreed. So you could have two things can be true at once, right? He could have done an allocution and given up rights to appeals because they took it off the board and did the whole deal. And one of my other concerns that you didn't happen to mention is there's a whole Proberger contingent out there.
Yeah.
The plea deal ensures Kohberger will spend the rest of his life behind bars for the horrific killings of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Zana Konodal, and Ethan Chapin. Prosecutors cited overwhelming evidence, including DNA from a knife sheath, cell phone data, and surveillance footage, linking Kohberger to the crime scene in Moscow, Idaho. Despite this, a group of Kohberger's supporters, dubbed Probergers, are standing by him, claiming he's innocent.
I mean, I could tell you from the comments from my previous video, I mean, people are literally saying
he didn't do it.
A patsy.
Yeah.
He didn't do it. He had to take a deal. And if he actually broke it down and said, okay, I drove there and this is what happened and why it happened, it would be much more solid, I think, for everybody involved.
You know, this reminds me, there's a case called, I always forget, it's either Alford versus North Carolina or North Carolina versus Alford, depending on the procedural posture at the time. But it was a Supreme Court case where this guy, Alford, was offered a plea deal, if you will. Okay, you plead guilty to this murder and we'll take the death penalty off the table. So in order to spare himself the death penalty, he pled guilty. And then later he wanted to withdraw his plea and say, well, I actually was not guilty and I want to withdraw the plea. And this issue went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, if a person wants to avail themselves knowingly and voluntarily of some type of a plea offer to avoid, maybe some worse kind of sentence, they may do so without admitting guilt. So the whole thing where the notion of someone pleading guilty and then coming back later and saying, even though I pled guilty, I didn't do it, that's a real thing. And there's a lot of people that believe that Kohberger pled guilty just to avoid the death penalty and not because he was guilty. Okay.
Like a no contest almost.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly what it's kind of like. So I get it. We really needed some more kind of closure. That's just one of the missteps that I lay at the feet of the prosecution team. And look, I'm sure that they put together a really good case. I'm not necessarily talking about, their competency to try the case or anything like that. Or
the prosecutor is supposed to be a legend, from what I understand. Like, he won some really hard cases.
But his PR game stinks. And the way that this was sold to the public and the way it was presented to the families just was a absolute disaster, in my opinion. I would have handled it differently.
Where is the murder weapon? The clothes you wore that night? What were Kaylee's last words?
Thompson, who negotiated the plea deal that took the death penalty off the table for Kohberger, telling us even if the case went to trial, he believes the families would still never have gotten those answers.
What do you say to those families who feel like that was doing a deal with the devil?
We made a proposal on our terms, not his.
I think there's still those who feel like it's what he wanted was life in prison versus the death penalty.
I would have not offered this kind of deal unless all the family members were on board with it. And I would not have, he was kind of at the sentencing, he was kind of, in my opinion, just a little bit over the top with covering his own six by going into elaborate detail about how this thing came to pass with the negotiated plea, and seemed to be trying to deflect criticism from his own office in the process. So a little bit too dramatic, a little bit too performative, in my opinion, for a sentencing hearing where what the outcome is, everything's decided. The only reason you're there is so the family members can have their say. But the judge, we knew what the sentence was going to be. I mean, the judge technically didn't have to do life without parole, but we knew he would. And we knew the defense wasn't going to have anything to say. They weren't going to present any evidence. They weren't going to make any argument. They'd already agreed to the sentence. So everything was already sort of, set in stone, more or less. And this was just a perfunctory thing so that the families could have their say. And it's, the Crime Victims Bill of Rights in most states requires it. So I don't know why he was so theatrical and dramatic, but hey, everybody's got their own style, I guess.
Okay, to throw a bone to the prosecution, because I don't want to just beat up on anybody.
Yeah, that's
or whatever. Is it possible, and you've tried a lot of different cases, that they may have wanted Dylan Mortensen to have to suffer cross-examination and be potentially further victimized on the stand in a trial? Like, because you had these really odd circumstances. I mean, I don't know how you break it down, but the 8 hours, I believe, before calling the police, and not even calling the police, calling somebody else to call the police, is peculiar. I understand shock. I understand a lot of things, but that could have been a very awkward time in the courtroom.
Look, you're right, and that would be a reason that would weigh in favor of capitulating to Kohberger's terms. I don't know that it would be enough. If I'm the prosecutor, I don't know if that alone would make the decision for me, because look, I would suspect, I suspect they could have tried this case and won this case without putting Dylan on the stand. And so there's,
Couldn't the defense call him?
The defense
have that right?
Well, yeah, they could. Yeah, they have the right to call witnesses as well, but it's different if you're the defense calling a witness, because you can't ask the leading cross-examination type questions. So, they could have blunted some of that by perhaps just not even calling that witness. But I mean, who knows? I'm speculating as to what their trial strategy may or may not have been. But certainly, the case, though, the evidence of his guilt was overwhelming. And, and we learned some things at the sentencing hearing too. We learned that maybe there was another weapon involved. And so we learned that maybe he was carrying a vacuum cleaner, little things like that, are very intriguing details.
Which is odd. You mean like a handy vac, or, because when you say carry a vacuum cleaner, it's like, there's ranges. Okay. I mean, there's Kirby's that are in the antique shop that weigh 100 pounds. And then there's like a handy vac that you use in the car or something that he's carrying around.
And we don't know. And presumably if there was a trial or a full allocution, we would know. So the fact that we're having to ask these kind of questions right now is just proof that there's just so much that needs to come out. And I understand that they're releasing information now, and they still have a lot of information left to release that people will be going through. But, I've looked at some of it. There's a lawyer friend of mine in California named Julie Hamill. She won't mind me mentioning her. She texted me. She actually has read through the whole thing, and she's like, I've got, now that I'm starting to see, I've got more questions now than I had before I started. And but that's reflective, I think, of most people's takeaway now that they're learning more about the police case file, if you will.
Well, okay, that brings up a good point too, because like in Howard Bloom's book, he discussed the FBI sitting on the DNA information and not sharing it with the locals while they were, tracking him, and then even losing the guy for a day because he took a different route that they didn't expect. Is it also possible that maybe there would be some embarrassment that could come forth during a trial? Like, no, you might have dropped the ball here, might have dropped the ball there, or it could be implied they dropped the ball one way or another.
Yeah, well, every case, whether you're on the defense side or the prosecution side, every case has I would say every case has warts of some kind, right? It doesn't mean that your case is invalid, or that you don't have a winning case, but every case has things that you would rather the other side, or you'd rather nobody actually talk about. But a lot of times, that just goes with the territory. Prosecutors get these I know when I was a prosecutor, I would get case files, and I would see things where the police made certain mistakes or things that I didn't like the way they did it. And, you just come right out to the jury and you just own it. And you say, look, nothing is perfect. This is what we've got, but we still have, abundant evidence of guilt. I don't know. We'll never know, I think, the full truth behind the prosecution's thinking. You can take their public statements at face value. You can see what they've said to people in interviews, but who knows what's really going on behind the scenes? We probably will never know all of the story.
Well, you have a unique background too, because you're also a police officer in addition. You're a lot like my friend, mutual friend, Nate the lawyer, who was a police officer, a prosecutor, a defense attorney. He also was a law professor. So I guess there's one more there, but that gives you kind of some insight that not necessarily everybody has, right? Where you can say, you can see a problem with police procedure at one point, or you can see problems with this or that, or what have you. One thing that came up, Megan Kelly actually pointed this out. It wasn't when she was on with you. It was like in a follow-up thing. And she had a valid point. The police officers were asked afterwards, they were asked, why is it you said this was a targeted incident and people should not have to worry?
So they had a presser right after the Kohberger hearing on Wednesday happened, and finally answered some questions, which they haven't done at all. And the first one related to, do you remember when the crime first happened, they put out a statement saying this was a targeted crime and that the community in Moscow, Idaho did not need to worry? And everyone had questions like, well, how do you know that?
Yeah, right. I recall her saying that, and I agree with her. They were very quick, as I recall, to come out and say, look, nope, the public doesn't have anything to be concerned with. They were worried about the student body and everybody just freaking out and everybody packing up and going home and that kind of thing, just getting away from there.
Worry.
That's a legitimate concern. So they came out and said it was targeted, but now they won't say why they used that choice of words. Was it targeted or was it not? Was it random? I doubt it was random. And they're basically saying that they're not aware of any connection that Kohberger had with any of these victims. I don't know that I believe that. I mean, I believe
I don't either.
There was some connection. I don't think he didn't just drive around that house multiple times.
How would he know? Yeah. How would he know where they are? Yeah. There were so many problems. Also, there is precedent. I don't know. Somebody reached out to me and they said, this is a copycat killer.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the Gainesville murders, also known as the Gainesville Ripper? The guy's name is Danny Rolling.
Back in 1990, a different college campus was terrorized by a killer on the loose. 5 University of Florida students were murdered. It happened over the course of 3 days. And there are a few similarities between that case and the University of Idaho quadruple murders.
There's another idea that the theory was that Kohberger was he went to where one of the victims worked in a vegan pizza place and had some kind of interaction with her as like a server. And of course, we know that Kohberger is a vegan. At least that's what he was trying to get vegan.
Or even saw her. He may not have interacted with her, just saw her at the restaurant going around.
Yeah. And then sort of started picking her out and targeting her from there. I do think that he was he had this, there was a lot of copycat kind of tendencies, right? I mean, even Ted Bundy, right? He's almost like he's trying to make himself look like and act like Ted Bundy or the Gainesville killer. There's lots of different possibilities.
There's a real interesting parallel because I'm interviewing an author coming up on the Gainesville killer, Danny Rolling, as a matter of fact. But Gainesville Rolling, everybody was like scared. They were like, did Ted Bundy get reincarnated? I mean, because he had just been executed the year before the Gainesville murders. But the parallels with the Gainesville killings are pretty shocking. Both of them are are college students in their apartments. Both involved a K-bar knife. With the vacuum cleaner, it makes me wonder because one thing that was used by Danny Rolling was dish soap. He brought something with him to clean up after himself when he committed the crimes. So there's some interesting parallels in this mix. The people have also pointed out the Elliot Rodger question. And as far as, I think you're talking about Maddie. Most people think that Maddie is his intended target. And Maddie looks very similar to a Kim Keneally.
Popular blonde cheerleader who was the target of unwanted attention for months from Brian Kohberger. Her mother has spoken publicly about how he would leave her love letters in her locker and make repeated awkward declarations of interest. He would always say, "Oh, Kim, I think you're very pretty." Just like weird comments, said the mom. And she would say, "Oh God, leave me alone." She did not give him the time of day. He was creepy. He was weird. He was, I think at the time, morbidly obese, and then would become a heroin addict. So really not like probably the most popular kid in school. And this Dr. Lieberman positing that the rejection delivered in a possibly public humiliating way may have planted the first seeds of rage. And that young woman looks remarkably like Maddie Mogan. I mean, to me, it's so interesting because unfortunately, they let this case go to, be pled out.
By the way, the author, it's James Patterson is the name I was looking for. Because he came out with a book called The Idaho 4. I haven't read it yet, but that's his, one of his theories was that, it was a copycat thing, and that he did have some direct contact prior to these killings with, at least some of the victims.
So I'm pretty sure that he saw at least a bit. I mean, why are you just going to randomly drive around and then hit a house and say, "Oh, hey, let's try our luck here"?
Yeah,
this seems odd.
Yeah, I mean, it just doesn't, it doesn't have the ring of truth to it that police are going to say credibly now that there was no connection to these kids. I'm just, look, I don't buy it. Seems like we're always talking about things, Eric, where we don't buy the official government story. Are we just conspiracy theorists by nature?
Maybe a little. No, I don't even know if it, sometimes conspiracy is not necessarily a theory. It's just early.
This is just sloppiness. There may have been some sloppiness to the investigation, but I'm talking about sloppiness in the public relations aspect to this case, from the beginning all the way to the end of the sentencing now.
Yeah. And it's so troubling. Oh, by the way, Jim Clemente, also, who I've interviewed before, he's an FBI profiler, high level. He's also behind Criminal Minds, the TV series. I'm sure you've heard of it. He believed that the suspect is a younger man, a first-time killer, and he knew at least one of the victims. He stated that all the way back from the jump. But I also wanted to address with you, do you think that Brian Kohberger, if he had gotten away, would do this again?
Yes, 100%. 100%. I think that I think this was his first experiment, if you will. He was just becoming active as a serial killer. And he goes back to his house or wherever he's living, apartment, whatever, and he takes this selfie. It looks like he's wearing this hoodie, right? And it looks like he's in the shower. It's like almost a shower rod or something behind him. Like maybe he's just cleaned himself up, put on a button-down shirt, had it buttoned all the way up to the top, and he takes this weird selfie. And it's almost, and he's like doing the thumbs up. It's almost like, is he just bragging now? Or is he thrilled? Is he happy? Is he riding this wave of this rush of adrenaline that he got from this? And what we see happens is, like with these serial killers, whatever thrill they get from doing it, and sometimes it's a sexual thrill they get. There's a lot, with serial killers, that's very, very common that they do this. There is a sexual component to their desire and their drive here, and they almost get like sexual arousal out of it. And then that dies off, right? And then they have to go hunting again. And I think that he was just getting started. If he hadn't have been caught, I'm sure he would have done it again.
And it was close. I mean, really, the DNA is what did him in. I don't know if he didn't leave that sheath, do you think he would have been caught?
I think that's probably right. It's the, that DNA is that they got from that sheath started the whole thing unwinding, where they were able to, use familial DNA and start getting a picture of who this could possibly be. Then they cross-reference it with other items of evidence. And the next thing you know, they zero in on a suspect. And once they zero in on a suspect, it doesn't take long to have enough to make the arrest. But they did a good job, I think, solving it in pretty quickly. So I'm not trying to beat up on the police and all that. I mean, I think that I just think it's a PR messaging kind of problem. But look, this is one that unfortunately now, because of the way I think it was bungled and the way the case was closed, it's just going to be something that people are going to continue to talk about forever. You're going to have people claiming that he's actually innocent, that he pled guilty just so he could avoid the death penalty. I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't, when he starts giving interviews, and he will, he's going to give interviews.
From what I understand, there's something scheduled this fall.
He's going to probably come out and say, you know what? The only reason I did that is to avoid the death penalty. Right. And whether he appeals or not, and by the way, even though he supposedly waives his right to appeal, he still can appeal. There's lots of ways he can do that.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah. So just for example, we talked about a few minutes ago, he had this, his lawyers had this defense theory that they were going to try to present where possibly 4 other individuals could have been the real killer. Right. So let's just say he hires an appellate lawyer, and the appellate lawyer says, look, okay, he had, you got a 6th Amendment right to a lawyer. And that means that by extension, you have the right to effective assistance of a lawyer. So the argument would be something along these lines. Look, I had this defense. I thought it was viable. The judge overruled us, but still I thought it was viable. But instead of appealing the judge's decision or asking to appeal the judge's decision, my lawyers told me to plead guilty to avoid the death penalty. I really didn't want to do it, but they talked me into it, and I wanted to fight, but I had ineffective assistance of counsel, and that's a constitutional claim. The Supreme Court says, you can't actually waive your right to appeal, particularly on things like that. So he could very well do that, or he could actually not appeal, and he could still, when he hits the interview circuit with, I'm sure people will be wanting to interview him, he can say that. He can say, yeah, you know what? I just did this to avoid the death penalty. I'm innocent. I didn't do this. I hope one day they catch the real killer. And then you're going to have
question though.
Yeah.
Let's say he does do that appeal. Okay. And let's say by some miracle he wins. Would that then generate a new trial?
Yep.
Could that put death penalty back on the table?
Yeah. So if hypothetically there is some kind of an appeal that would result in essentially a grant of a new trial, even though that's the way it would be called it would be if it was reversed, it would be remanded for a new trial, even though there wasn't an actual trial. And then at that trial, they would have to still prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and they could seek the death penalty. But the problem is, by the time anything like that were to ever come to pass, I think the odds of that are essentially zero, but we're talking about here in the world of hypotheticals. By the time anything goes up on appeal and comes back, it could be years and years, or maybe a decade or more. And by then, witnesses become unavailable. Forensic evidence is degraded or perhaps unusable. Lots of things that can happen 10 years down the road to make the case less prosecutable than it was in August or July of 2025. So, yeah, I mean, if you're awarded a new trial much further down the road on some kind of an appeal or a habeas corpus action, it can really be difficult for prosecutors to put everything back together and get it ready for trial so far after the fact.
But there is also the potential that you could risk putting the thing back on that you tried to duck.
Yeah. So, I mean, and the judge warned him and said, look, even if if you try to appeal, the Supreme Court has said, look, you can appeal, but that might be a breach of your plea agreement as well. And so if you breach a contract, well, sometimes if you breach a contract, and that's what plea deals are, then you may go back to square one, and maybe they say, okay, fine, we'll agree to your request for a new trial, but it's going to be with the death penalty attached to it.
Okay. Well, I would think, and you've been a prosecutor before, that would be the way you would want to bring it, right? So you could say, okay, if you're going to do this, this is what you're going to face.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think the prosecution, I think that would be the last thing they would want to do. They want this to be over. They don't want to have to deal with this anymore. They want Kohberger packaged up and shipped off and never to be seen from again. So the last thing that they want is for him to do something to try to breach the plea agreement that would somehow force some kind of a new trial. But look, these are all very speculative and hypothetical, and I don't want anybody to misinterpret what I'm saying. I'm not suggesting these things are likely to happen. I think the most likely thing is he's going to stay in prison for the rest of his life, and he's not really going to mount any kind of serious appeal, probably none at all. And he is going to give interviews, but but I don't think we can count on him to tell the truth.
Well, I was going to say, he could eat off that truth for a while, if he wanted to. And can we get into that? Because I know there are certain laws about how he can't profit off of interviews directly, but that doesn't mean necessarily that his family won't profit or things like that. Correct?
Yeah, that's right. And I'm not familiar with what Idaho's specific law is on that. I'm sure people who watch this video may be more informed on it than I am, but generally that's correct. The idea is that we don't want people to profit off of criminal activity, and that would include any book deals or interviews or anything like that. So, but there are ways, and we've seen it before, I guess, in other cases where folks skirt those rules, and they it's kind of like the way politicians do. They make arrangements for their family to get paid even when they can't. So, unfortunately it does happen. Hopefully it won't, but it wouldn't surprise me if somebody doesn't try that.
Well, the Giglo case, I think it's called the Giglo Beach murders or something up in New York. From what I understand, Gilgo Beach. Okay. From what I understand, his wife is selling her life story, and voila, there you go. There's a way around it. And they're suing to try to stop her, or somebody ruled, to supposedly stop her from doing that.
Yeah. Well,
the same thing could happen here, right? His father could sell his life story and tell the whole story from the father's view. And
yeah. And in Gilgo Beach, that guy hasn't been convicted yet either. So that's another sort of impediment to probably trying to stop the wife from doing it. So, it's just kind of unfortunate, but people do obviously profit off of other people's crimes. I mean, it's kind of what we're in the business of is talking about true crime and things like that. And it's because people are interested in it. People are fascinated by true crime and all this stuff because it's intellect to me. It's like intellectually fascinating. There's a certain curiosity that we all have about wanting to know more about things that are just full of intrigue, like Kohberger and Gilgo Beach and all the rest of them. And so it draws a lot of attention. So for the same reason people are watching this video, people might be interested in finding out how Brian Kohberger's mother, for example, may have coped with all of this, because it's worth pointing out that she's a victim too. He did all these terrible things and he shattered the lives of all these kids and their families, but he also destroyed his own family's life through his conduct. And, they are truly victims, and people will be curious to see how they cope with things as well. I remember when I was a prosecutor, one of the saddest parts of my job, especially is like after a trial and someone's having to go off to prison, is seeing the family members, the mothers, the fathers, the wives, the children of these people who through their actions caused, this devastation within their own families. And so it was really, it tugs on the heartstrings a little bit to see people who are truly innocent suffer because what some family member of theirs has done.
I could totally see that. The sister immediately pops in my mind because she kind of seemed to be on to him for a while. Like she confronted the father saying, look, this all went down there. Why is he collecting all these things and wrapping them? Why is he cleaning his car so obsessively? Why is he doing this? It was her phone that got Brian Kohberger locked up to begin with back as a teenager. So I'm just thinking that sister, out of all the family members, in a lot of ways, I would love to spend some time speaking to a sister about what she knew when she is a psychologist or psychiatrist currently, or counselor, but she works in the mental health field. So I'm sure that she has a lot of thoughts on this. Can we reach into your experience a little bit though? Have you ever dealt with anything, maybe not to the scope? I mean, this got so much national publicity, but it isn't the biggest crime that's ever happened either. Have you ever had to face it as a prosecutor or a defense lawyer? Something like this?
Well, yeah, I mean, we certainly didn't. We had some high profile things. We didn't have anything that was to this level. I've been involved in, homicide cases on both sides of the thing. And I remember one case, it was actually a double murder, but it had to do with, there was some drug dealers that decided to go open up their own business, so to speak. And so their prior employer didn't want to do that. And so he enforced a non-compete agreement through force of arms, killed two of them. And I remember though, we still needed some information from him about some other things. And so we built it into the plea deal that he was going to have to sit down and talk to us. And actually, like, just from an academic perspective, just being able to have this one-on-one where they've already pleaded guilty, they have no reason to lie, and then they start explaining to you the why of it all. So I have actually experienced that, not in this kind of case, but in a different way. And it's always better, I think, to have more information than less. And it was weird. That particular guy actually sent me Christmas cards from prison every year for a number of years, not to my home, but to my office at the prosecutor's office. But because he said he felt that I treated him fairly. So he sent me, Christmas cards. Weird stuff happens. But, there are people that get caught up in the criminal justice system who are innocent. And that's another fascinating aspect of the true crime as well, is like exploring wrongful convictions and the things that lead to wrongful convictions. Things like, why do people actually will, Eric, plead guilty to things that they didn't do? And a lot of
False
times
confessions.
it's to get out of jail, or to maybe avoid the death penalty, or to avoid some kind of harsher prison sentence. So it happens in real life. It happens in my practice. I see it a lot. And so the general public is not aware that this is so common, but people who practice in this field know it. It's very, very common. So there's just so many things about the justice system that you can look at through the lens of the Kohberger case. And I suspect we'll continue to be doing that for a long time.
A good example of that, like when you talk about people pleading it out, our mind goes immediately to the highest level crime, but isn't it a lot of times much lower level crimes where a person has to make a choice of, okay, if I cop a plea here, I didn't do the damn thing, but I will get out of prison tomorrow, or I'll get out of jail tomorrow for time served, or whatever it is. We have an arrangement. I won't lose my job. I can continue working. I can feed my family, things like that. Is that sometimes what comes into people sometimes taking a plea for something, even though they didn't do it, just because they need to go on with their life?
I had a client who was provably innocent, who was accused of murdering her husband. And she took a plea deal to plead kind of like a no contest to voluntary manslaughter. So it's a significant reduction, but still a very heavy charge that carries potentially and usually a lot of prison time. And the reason that she did that, and I can talk about this because I did when I had my podcast, we did a whole mini series on her case. But she pleaded guilty so that she she wouldn't risk a jury getting it wrong and having, because the only penalty would be life in prison for the murder conviction if a jury had found her guilty. So she pled guilty, and the prosecutor recommended, I think, 15 years, something along those lines, maybe 12. But we had a sentencing hearing that lasted 6 or 7 hours. And at the end of it, the judge says, well, you know what? I think she's innocent, so I'm going to give her straight probation, which is unheard of for manslaughter. We went back a few years later, and the judge did an early termination of her probation. So she got off probation after about 3 years. In a case that started out as a murder. But I can tell you, as certain as I'm sitting here, she actually was innocent, but she got caught up in the system, and she made a very difficult choice. But she did it for the benefit of her children, and didn't want to risk maybe a jury getting it wrong. So through the back door, so to speak, we got everything we needed, which was, well, keeping her out of prison, which was the main goal there. So, you know, there's just all kinds of reasons. And then I see people that, okay, so they're in jail. They're stuck in jail for shoplifting or damage to property. They don't have a lot of money, or their family's not willing to bond them out of jail. They've been in jail a month, and they really got to get back to work before they lose their job. So they'll say, fine, I'll just plead guilty and get put on probation. So that kind of thing happens too. So innocent people will plead guilty. People who actually might otherwise want to have their day in court, to have their trial, to make the state prove them guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, which is their constitutional right. They will waive those things just to get out of jail, or just to put it behind them. So those are not illegitimate reasons, but that's kind of the more common thing that we see just all the time. So, and people, false confessions, people will confess to crimes that they didn't do too. And that's a fascinating thing. We could talk for hours about that.
Yes, I actually am trying to schedule somebody who does research in the false confession area. And one thing that pops in my head, I don't know if I've talked to you about it before or not, but I've interviewed Albert Vray multiple times, and I learned from Albert Vray. He's a professor he's in England right now. He's Dutch, but he studies deception. I mean, like literally clinically studies it, not just a body language guy or whatever per se. He studies it at the university level. But he talked about the fact that in the United States, unlike in England and from what I understand, most of Europe, the police are not allowed to lie there, but they're allowed to lie here.
Yeah.
And is it possible that a false confession can be spurred on by a police officer lying and saying, I have a witness who saw you, and the person, being questioned is like, I don't know how they could. I wasn't there, but what am I going to do? I mean, they've got all the witnesses, they've got everything else. I'm screwed.
Yeah. And this ties in. That is true. That is oftentimes a component of false confessions. That's also very similar to the idea of false memory. I interviewed Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, who's probably the
famous top in the world,
the top person on the psychology of the science of human memory in the world. And she has done her own studies where she can make people remember stuff that they didn't even do. So it's I'm not the expert on it, but it's very fascinating. And this is why people love to talk about the real criminal justice system and real true crime, because you get all of these things that that factor into any given case.
Yeah, no, Elizabeth Loftus is a legend. She also, I believe, has done work with Robert Lifton when he was alive about a lot of cult activity, which is also fascinating. It's all about manipulation of the mind and memory and witness testimony. We go down that track as well. As an example, and you're being a cop, I'm sure you ran into it. I could tell you, if I was held up at a store, for example, the thing I would probably remember the most clearly is the gun itself that was pointed at me, even over their face or anything else, because that would be the focus of my attention. Am I going to get shot? or am I not going to get shot? And I could be a completely unreliable witness. Have you run into that?
Weapon focus is one of the big pieces of it. Cross-racial identification is also an issue. I'll tell you a story. To me, it's kind of funny. So many years ago, I won't tell you exactly how many, but it was right around 1989, when I was in the police academy. To illustrate the point, and cops are actually trained on this. So cops know, and they should know. Sometimes they forget, but they're trained on the faultiness or unreliability of eyewitness identification, and also eyewitness testimony, by the way, in court. So we were sitting there talking about something in class, and it was completely unrelated. And now, mind you, we were all in the police academy, but they didn't let us have firearms in the room. So someone who turned out to be a cop or a professor, one of our teachers or something, busts in the room wearing something or other on their head and brandishing a gun, and comes in and robs our teacher, okay, who was himself unarmed. And it came in real fast, and it was a real gun, and took a wallet and keys and stuff like that, and then left the room real quick. And then we were asked, all of us, to, like, within a couple of minutes or so, we were asked to write out a description of the person we just saw do that. And everybody's was different, and everybody's was wrong. Like, nobody got it right. And everybody in the class had an entire different recollection of, was it a black male, a white male? Was it a ski mask, or was it a hat? What color was the shirt? What color was the gun? And nobody got all these details right. And it was a good way of showing us right out of the gate that just because somebody says they're sure about what they saw, take it maybe with a grain of salt, and you got to corroborate it with other evidence, because eyewitnesses frequently, through no fault of their own, but for psychological reasons, they just get it wrong.
Yeah. And you can also inject things too. Like if you show up a lineup too early, they recognize somebody from a lineup, and then they start to picture that person is the individual or whatever. Right.
Yeah. We call that the power of like suggestion. Right. So let's just say, I'm the cop, and you get mugged, and I go down the street and I see somebody matching the description you gave me, and I pick them up, throw them in the back of my car, and I drive them back around to where you are, and they're sitting in the back of my patrol car. And I say, "Hey, Eric, is that him?" And here we have a guy in handcuffs in the back of a police car that matches your description. And if it's the wrong guy, you're more likely to say, "Yeah, that's him," because he's in the back of a police car. So, those are called show ups, and there's a place for them in police investigations sometimes, but it's not the best way to do identifications. And I will say that, as in the 40 or so years I've been in the criminal justice system, police procedure in this area is much, much better than it used to be. So, like, instead of using a show up identification like I just described, or even like the lineup where you have live people behind a glass, and you say, "It looks like number 3," or whatever, you we call it a 6-pack, which is like 6 photographs of people that, and you put your suspect in there, but then if you're the cop who put it together, who the bad guy is. So instead of you presenting it to the witness, you bring in your colleague that's not even associated with the case, and who doesn't know which one it is either, and have your colleague present it to the witness and say, "Okay, the suspect or the person that did this may or may not be in this, but would you take a look at this and see if you recognize anybody?" And so that's a much more, it's better, it's more reliable, and it avoids a lot of the misidentification that oftentimes leads to wrongful convictions.
All right. Well, to wrap things up, I'm going to circle all the way back to the initial thing, and let's close it out on Kohberger. What have you learned from all this, and what are you looking to find out over time.
Well, I'm interested to see in whatever else is released by the prosecution and by the police out there, and they've told us that they're going to release more of it. I'm looking to answer certain questions, but it's the big one is why? What was his motive? But they've said they don't have a motive, but I just wonder if when you actually get a look at the actual case file and all the documents in there, if we're not going to be able to glean some kind of motive. I think that one will emerge, and that's the main thing I'm looking for is why, and by extension, why these particular kids, what was the connection? Why did he target them? And I believe they were targeted, but those are the main things I want to know the answers to. And I think so many others do. And I'm sure the family do as well. All right.
Now, on that note, I'm going to speculate, but I've been of the feeling and impression that only one was targeted.
Yeah.
And
yep,
things went out of control unexpectedly.
I think
especially
that's probably
with Maddie literally sleeping in a bed with somebody who wasn't normally there.
Correct.
That had to.
I think you're barking up the right tree.
So horrible.
Your instincts, I think, serve you well, my friend.
Well, thank you. And my instincts are to have Phil Holloway on the show as often as possible to learn more. And folks, you can check him out starting soon with MK True Crime. And Phil, thank you so much, my friend.
All right, you bet, brother.